The first thing I recorded about the human team was that they were laughing. They arrived at the proving in the standard transit shuttle, 6 of them, carrying equipment that was visibly inferior to what the contest required, and they came down the ramp into the great receiving hall of Tessivar talking among themselves and laughing at something one of them had said, the way a species laughs when it has not yet been told how much trouble it is in. I noted this in my chronicle as a sign of unreadiness. I have since had a long time to think about how wrong that single note was, and how confidently I made it. My name, rendered as closely as your language permits, is Oven. I'm a chronicler of the Ilving, and I have served at the proving for what your people would count as 900 years. My function is to record the induction of new species into galactic standing. When a young civilization is admitted to the wider community, it does not simply take its place. It must be measured, and the institution that measures it is the proving at Tessivar, and the discipline through which it is measured is the cadence. I should explain the cadence, because everything that follows depends on it. The cadence is a contest of move and counter, part physical and part strategic, conducted on a contest floor between 2 competitors. It is not a fight. A fight is decided by force, and the cadence is decided by something subtler, the ability to read an opponent's intention a fraction of a moment before they commit to it, and to answer in a way they did not expect. The masters of the cadence describe it as a conversation in which both speakers are trying to finish each other's sentences. It is the discipline by which the galaxy has measured the minds of its species for longer than the Ilvain have kept records, and the Ilvain have kept records for a very long time. A species standing for the coming century is set by how it performs in the cadence at its induction. This is not a small thing. Standing determines a species' voice in the community, its access to the network of trade and protection, the degree to which the older powers take it seriously. A species that performs poorly at its induction spends 100 years climbing out of the hole it dug on its first day. Most never climb out at all. They are filed, as we say, near the bottom of the record, and the record is patient and does not move quickly. I had recorded 206 inductions across my service. I had developed, across those 2 centuries, a reliable sense for how a species would perform within moments of watching them move. The graceful species did well. The disciplined species did well. The species that had spent their pre-contact history perfecting some art of body or mind did very well. The humans, when I watched them come down the ramp, were none of these things. They moved like a species that had never needed to be precise, that had survived by being adequate at a great many things rather than excellent at any one of them. I filed them, provisionally, near the bottom, and I prepared to record a routine induction. Their opponent had already been assigned. When a species standing is genuinely in question, the proving matches them against the reigning champion, so that the measurement is taken against the highest possible standard. The reigning champion of the cadence, and he had held the title for what your people would count as 4 centuries, was a Threll named Keithrin. The Threll are a martial aristocratic species who have practiced the cadence as the center of their entire civilization for thousands of years. To be the Threll champion is to be the finest practitioner of the discipline alive, and Keithrin was not merely the finest of his generation. He was widely held to be the finest who had ever lived. He had not lost a contest of the cadence in 400 years. He had not, in the assessment of those who studied him, been seriously pushed in 200. When the assignment was announced, the assembled representatives of the older species treated the outcome of humanity's induction as already written, and so, I confess, did I. The human captain was a woman named Lena Marsh. She came to the chronicler's gallery on the first evening to introduce her team, which was a courtesy most species did not bother with, and she did it without any of the nervousness I expected from someone whose civilization was about to be measured and found wanting. "We're glad to be here," she said. "We know we're not favored." I told her, as gently as my function allowed, that her species was not favored because the discipline they were about to attempt, was one their opponent had practiced for longer than humanity had possessed writing, and that she should prepare her people for a difficult measurement. "Oh, we're going to lose," she said, and she said it cheerfully as a simple fact, the way you might note the weather. "We just want to see how he does it." I recorded that too. I did not understand it. I filed it under the charming misconceptions that young species bring to the proving, the ones the proving exists to correct. The contests began the following day, and the humans lost. They lost the first contest badly. Marsh did not fight it herself. The humans, unusually, rotated their competitors, putting up a different team member for each round, which struck the assembled observers as either a failure of nerve or a failure to understand that the cadence rewards a single refined practitioner, not a committee. The human they put up first was a large, slow man named Holloway, and Catherine read him so completely that the contest was less a conversation than a demonstration, the champion finishing every sentence before Holloway had begun to speak it. It was over quickly. The gallery made the small collective sound the older species make when something proceeds exactly as expected. And then the human did the thing I would spend the next many days failing to understand. Holloway, beaten, picked himself up off the contest floor, and instead of retreating in the manner of a defeated competitor, he crossed to where Catherine stood and he grinned, a wide human expression of what I took at first for poor sportsmanship, and he said, "That third movement, the one where you turned my own commit against me. Would you show me that again? Slower." Catherine, who had defeated a great many opponents across 4 centuries, had clearly never been asked this. There was a pause on the contest floor that I noted carefully because I did not know how to categorize it. Then the champion, perhaps out of the courtesy that is central to Threll honor, perhaps out of simple confusion, showed him. He performed the movement again slowly, and the human watched it with an intensity that did not match his defeat, and then he thanked the champion and walked off the floor. I recorded this as an oddity. I did not yet see it as anything else. They lost the second contest, the third, the fourth. They put up a different competitor each time, and each time the competitor lost, and each time the beaten human did the same baffling thing, approaching the champion afterward and asking him to explain how he had done it, and Catherine, increasingly bemused, kept showing them. By the 5th contest, the other species in the gallery had begun to find it comic. The humans had become a kind of entertainment, the species who lost and then thanked the winner and asked for a lesson, and I heard a daffy representative remark that humanity seemed to have mistaken its induction for a school. The remark drew laughter. I did not laugh, but only because chroniclers do not because I disagreed. It was around the 6th contest that I noticed something in the data that I could not immediately explain, and because I am a chronicler and the inability to explain something is intolerable to me, I went back to the records. The cadence is scored. Each contest produces a numerical measure of how closely the contestants matched, how many of the opponent's intentions each one read correctly, how long the loser survived before the pattern of their defeat became inevitable. These scores are the substance of my chronicle, the raw material from which standing is calculated. And when I laid the human scores out in order across the 6 contests, I saw a thing that did not match anything in 200 years of records. They were losing. That much was unchanged, but the scores were climbing. Each human competitor read more of Catherine's intentions than the last. Each one survived longer before the inevitable. The margin of defeat in the 6th contest was less than half the margin in the first. The line, when I plotted it, was not flat in the way a defeated species line is flat. It was rising. It was rising steadily, contest over contest, at a rate I had no precedent for. I plotted Catherine's scores beside it. The champion's line was, as the champion's line always is, perfect and level, a straight horizontal of absolute consistent mastery. He had performed at the highest possible standard in the first contest, and he had performed at exactly the same standard in the 6th, because he had reached the highest possible standard 4 centuries ago and had remained there ever since, which is what it means to be the finest who ever lived. I sat with the two lines for a long time that night, one flat and high, one low and rising, and I told myself that it did not matter, that the rising line was still far below the flat one, that the humans were improving from a position so far behind that the improvement was irrelevant, that they would run out of contests before the lines met. I told myself the comforting thing, which was that mastery is a destination, and the humans were simply very far from it and would not arrive in time. I did not yet ask the question I should have asked, which was not how far apart the lines were. It was whether one of them could move. The proving's final trial was announced on the 9th day. It is always the same trial. After the preliminary contests have taken a species measure, there is a single decisive contest against the reigning champion, longer and more demanding than the rest, and the result of that contest sets the species standing for the century. It is the contest that matters. The preliminary rounds are diagnostic. The final is the verdict. By every reasonable reading, the verdict was already in. The humans had lost every preliminary contest. Their best result was a defeat by a margin that, while smaller than their first, was still decisive. The gallery regarded the final as a formality, a last public confirmation of a standing that the preliminary rounds had already established. Keithran himself, I was told, had asked whether the final was even necessary given the clear results, and had been informed that the rules required it, and had accepted this with the patience of a champion performing a ceremony. I should have shared the gallery's certainty. I had shared it 9 days earlier, but I had spent those 9 days looking at two lines on a chart, and the lines had not stopped doing what they were doing. By the 9th day, the human scores had climbed to a place that, while still below Keithran's, was no longer comically below it. The rising line had risen, and the flat line had not moved because it could not move, because there was nowhere above it for it to go. I went to Captain Marsh on the evening before the final. I told myself I was gathering material for my chronicle, which was true, but it was not the whole of why I went. I had begun to feel the first edge of something I had not felt in 200 years of recording inductions, which was uncertainty about an outcome I had already filed. "You have lost every contest," I said to her. "Tomorrow you will lose the one that sets your standing for 100 years. I do not understand why your people are not afraid." She was sitting with the youngest member of her team, a small, quick woman named Priya Nair, who had lost the 7th and 8th contests, and who would, I learned, be the one to fight the final. They had a record of every preliminary contest displayed in front of them, Keithran's movements broken down and annotated, and they had clearly been studying it for a long time. "We've been doing this for 9 days, Marsh said. "He's been doing it for 400 years. You'd think that gap would be hopeless." She gestured at the display. "But here's the thing we figured out around the 3rd contest. He's not learning anything. Every round we learn his whole game a little better, and he learns nothing about ours because he's certain there's nothing in our game worth learning. Why would the greatest master who ever lived study the people who keep losing to him?" "Because you keep asking him to teach you," I said slowly, understanding for the first time what I had been recording as an oddity. "Every contest, you lose and you ask him to show you how, and he shows you." "He shows us," Marsh agreed. "He's a genuinely honorable guy. He's taught us his entire repertoire across 9 days, one movement at a time, because we asked nicely and he had no reason not to. He thinks he's being gracious to a doomed species." She looked at me. "He's not wrong that he's the best there's ever been at the cadence. He's just wrong about what that means. He thinks it means he can't be beaten. What it actually means is that he stopped getting better 400 years ago, and he never noticed, because nobody he fought was getting better either. Everyone he beat just stayed beaten." I went back to the gallery that night and I plotted the lines one more time, and I extended them forward, past the preliminary contests, into the longer space of the final trial. A final contest of the cadence runs many times the length of a preliminary round. It gives a rising line a great deal more room to rise. I extended the human line at the rate it had held for 9 days, and I extended Kithrin's line flat, because flat was the only direction it had ever gone, and somewhere in the long space of the final trial on my chart, the two lines crossed. I told myself my projection was unsound. I told myself you cannot extend a young species' improvement indefinitely, that they would plateau as all species plateau, that the slope would flatten before it reached the champion's level. These were reasonable objections, and I made all of them. But underneath them, I had begun to understand the shape of the thing I had been watching for 9 days, and the shape frightened me, because it was a shape my 200 years of records had no entry for. I had measured 206 species by how high they could reach. I had never once measured how fast they were still rising, because no species I had ever recorded was still rising on the day I measured them. They arrived at their induction having already become what they were going to be. The humans had arrived as something I had never seen at a proving. They had arrived unfinished and still building and unafraid of how far they had to go. The final trial of humanity's induction began at the height of the following day, in the great contest hall of Tessavar, before the assembled representatives of every species in galactic standing. I was in the chronicler's gallery with the record open before me. Across the hall, Kithrin took the contest floor with the unhurried ease of a champion who had performed this ceremony many times, and against him, small and quick and entirely unintimidated, came the youngest of the humans, Priya Nair, who 9 days earlier had not known the cadence existed. The contest was long. I want to record that honestly, because the way the older species later told the story made it sound sudden, and it was not sudden. It was the longest contest of the cadence I had recorded in my service, and for most of its length, Kithrin was winning. He fought from 4 centuries of perfect mastery, and the mastery was real, every bit of it. He read the humans' intentions and answered them before they formed. He finished her sentences, as the masters say, again and again, and each time he did, the score moved toward him, and the gallery settled deeper into the certainty it had brought into the hall. For the first third of the contest, it looked exactly like the 7 that had come before it, the doomed species and the inevitable master, the conversation in which only one speaker knew the language. But Priya Nair did not fight the way the previous humans had fought. She fought from everything they had lost. Every movement Kithrin made, she had seen before in a preliminary contest performed slowly at her own team's request by the champion himself. Every pattern he reached for, the humans had catalogued across 9 days of cheerful defeat. She was not reading his intentions a fraction of a moment before he committed to them. She did not need to. She already knew them. He had taught them to her. And so slowly, across the long middle of the contest, the conversation began to change. The champion finished her sentences less often. She began once or twice to finish his. The score, which had moved steadily toward him, slowed and held and began with terrible reluctance to move back. I watched it on my display, and I watched the 2 lines I had plotted the night before begin, in real time, in front of the assembled galaxy to converge. Kithrin felt it before the gallery did. I saw the moment it reached him, a hesitation so small that only a chronicler watching for it would have caught it, the moment when a champion who has not been seriously pushed in 200 years feels, for the first time in living memory, an opponent inside his own intentions. And in that moment, he did the thing that decided the contest, though no one watching understood it as the deciding moment, because it looked like nothing at all. He reached for something new. He had to. The human had learned his entire repertoire, and so the repertoire was no longer enough, and Kithrin, the finest practitioner who had ever lived, attempted in the long middle of that contest to do the one thing he had not done in 400 years. He tried to improve. He tried to invent, in the moment, a movement the humans had not catalogued, a new sentence in a language he had stopped adding to before humanity learned to write. And he could not do it well. That was the thing I understood, watching from the gallery, the thing that rearranged 200 years of my records in the space of a single contest. He could not do it well, because the capacity to do it well is not the same capacity as mastery, and he had spent 4 centuries perfecting the one while the other quietly atrophied from disuse. The muscle that learns is not the muscle that performs, and Kithrin had performed flawlessly for 400 years, and had not learned anything in all that time, because he had never once needed to. His new movement was clumsy. It was the new movement of a beginner, because in the one thing that now mattered, the ability to become something he was not yet, the greatest master who ever lived was a beginner, and he was facing a species that had been a beginner for 9 days straight and had gotten very, very good at it. Priya Nair read his clumsy new movement the way she had read everything else, because reading new things was the only thing she had ever done here, and she answered it, and the score crossed. The contest did not end there. It ended a long time later on a knife's edge, by the smallest margin the cadence can measure, after Kithrin fought back with everything 4 centuries had given him, and the human held against it with everything 9 days had given her. But it was decided in that long middle, in the moment the master tried to grow and found he had forgotten how, and the beginner did the only thing she knew, which was grow. When it ended, the great hall of Tessivar was silent in the particular way a room is silent when every certainty in it has been revised at once. And on the contest floor, Priya Nair, who had just done a thing no young species had done in the history of the proving, picked herself up, crossed to where Kithrin stood, and grinned the wide human grin I had been recording for 9 days as a charming defect. "That new thing you tried near the end," she said, "that was incredible. Would you show me that again, slower?" Kithrin did not answer her at first. He stood on the contest floor of a hall where he had not lost in 4 centuries, and he looked at the small human who had beaten him, and I watched a thing move across his face that I had no entry for in 200 years of recording the faces of defeated masters, because I had never recorded the face of this master defeated. It was not anger. Threll honor does not permit anger at a fair defeat, and the defeat had been fair. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has just been handed irrefutable evidence that a thing they were certain of was wrong, and who has not yet finished the slow internal work of understanding what else, therefore, might also be wrong. "How?" he said finally. "It was not quite a question. I have studied the cadence for 400 years. You have studied it for 9 days. How?" It was Captain Marsh who answered him, coming down from the competitors' gallery to stand beside the young human who had won. She answered him the way the human commander on the dying moon had answered the warlord, the way humans always seem to answer this question when the powerful finally ask it, without triumph, with great care, as though the answer were a fragile thing they did not want to break in the handing over. "You taught her," Marsh said. "Every movement she used against you today, you showed us yourself across 9 days because we lost and asked you how and you were gracious enough to tell us. We didn't beat you with anything that wasn't yours." She paused. "And you never learned a single thing from us in all that time because you were certain there was nothing to learn. That's the whole of it. We lost every contest and learned from every loss. You won every contest and learned from none of them. 9 days of that, and the lines crossed." "I am the finest who has ever practiced this discipline," Kithrin said, and he did not say it as a boast. He said it the way a person says a thing they have built their entire life upon and are watching come apart. "That is not in dispute. It was never in dispute." "It's still true," Marsh said gently. "You're the best there's ever been, I mean that. Nobody will ever perform the cadence the way you can." She looked at him. "But you finished becoming that a long time ago, and then you stopped, and you called stopping perfection. And perfection's a beautiful thing, but it doesn't move. The second you stop getting better, you've set a ceiling, and anyone still climbing is going to reach it eventually, no matter how high it is or how far below it they start. You didn't lose to her. You lost to the 400 years you spent not needing to learn anything." Kithrin was quiet for a long moment. And then he did a thing that the Threll record would later note as the first of its kind, the act that began to change his own civilization's relationship to its oldest art. He inclined his head to the young human, the gesture the Threll used to acknowledge a teacher, and he said, Show me how you learn." And Priya Nair, beaming, said, "Sure. But honestly, you basically taught us, so we should probably start with that thing you tried at the end, because it was genuinely amazing and we have no idea how you did it." I recorded the exchange in full. It is, I think, the most important entry I have made in 900 years of keeping the record, and it is the one I understood least at the time I wrote it. I revised the methodology of the proving in the cycle that followed, and the revision was the most significant change to galactic induction in the history of the institution, and I want to record clearly that I did not propose it out of wisdom. I proposed it out of the simple, intolerable fact that my methodology had produced a verdict that the contest had then overturned in front of every species in standing, and a chronicler cannot abide a method that is wrong. For 2 centuries, the proving had measured the young species by their ceiling, by the highest a thing they could reach on the day we measured them. It was a sound method, and it had filed 206 species accurately, because all 206 had arrived at their induction having already become what they were going to be. They had a ceiling, and we measured it, and the measurement held because the ceiling never moved. The humans had no ceiling we could find. They had a slope, and a slope is a different kind of thing than a ceiling, and it must be measured differently, because a ceiling tells you where a species is and a slope tells you where a species is going, and for a species still rising on the day you meet them, where they are is the least interesting thing about them. I added the slope to the record. I began, for the first time in 900 years, to measure not only how high a species could reach, but how fast they were still rising when we met them, and whether they had stopped rising at all, because I had learned in a single contest that a species which has stopped rising is a finished thing, and a species which has not is something the older measure could not see. When I applied the new measure backward across the record, the results disturbed the council for a long time, because a great many of the older species, the powerful ones, the ones who had held high standing for centuries, measured very poorly on the slope. They had reached great heights long ago, and then, like Kithrin, they had stopped, and called stopping mastery, and the record had been recording their ceilings for centuries while quietly failing to notice that none of them were moving anymore. The galaxy standing, it turned out, had been built on a measure of where everyone had once arrived, and almost no one had asked in all that time who was still going somewhere. I think often about the question Kithrin asked on the contest floor. How? It is the same question the warlord asked in the failing corridor, the same question the great statesmen ask in the conclave chambers, the question every powerful and finished thing in the galaxy eventually asks when it meets humanity and discovers that the certainty it was built on does not hold. How did a species this young, this unrefined, this far below us, do this? And the answer is always some version of the same answer, and it is never the answer the question expects, because the question is looking for a hidden strength, and the answer is never a strength. It is the absence of a particular weakness. The powerful species of the galaxy share a single quiet flaw, which is that they arrived somewhere magnificent and then they stopped, and they mistook the stopping for the magnificence. And the humans, who have not yet arrived anywhere magnificent, who lose constantly and cheerfully and ask their conquerors to please show them how it was done, have not stopped. And a thing that has not stopped will eventually pass a thing that has, no matter how far ahead the stopped thing began. Every civilization that has met humanity has learned the same lesson, and they have learned it in one of 2 ways. Some learn it the way I learned it, from the chronicler's gallery, watching 2 lines on a chart do a thing the record said was impossible, revising a verdict I was certain of before the contest taught me otherwise. And some learn it the way Kithrin learned it, by being the finest there has ever been at something, by being so certain of mastery that they teach it freely to the laughing beginners who keep losing, and then by standing on a contest floor 400 years into an unbeaten career, and watching a 9-day novice answer a movement they themselves invented only moments before. The smart ones learn it by watching. I would recommend, to any species reading this who has not yet had the lesson, that they choose the first way. The proving still runs at Tessivar, and the cadence is still the discipline by which we measure the young, but we measure them differently now, and the difference is the humans, who came down the ramp laughing and lost every contest, and were filed near the bottom of the record by a chronicler who had recorded 200 inductions, and had never once been surprised. I keep the chart from that final contest where I can see it. 2 lines, one high and flat, the most beautiful flat line in the history of the discipline, the ceiling no one will ever reach again. One low and rising, and crossing the first at the place where a master who had forgotten how to learn met a beginner who had never learned anything else. It changes nothing about the outcome to keep it, the outcome being long settled and a matter of record. But I have found in the years since that the outcome was never the part worth keeping. The part worth keeping is the slope, and the slope is still rising, somewhere out there in a species that has not yet stopped, and does not, as far as I have been able to determine, intend to.